Star Trend. I'm the owner of Street Bookstore, and I am here to introduce Mairead, who has the coolest name. We just discussed this with her father. Mairead Silmaril Small Stave, and thank you for throwing the Silmaril in there. I love that. Mairead was a graduate of the Academy in 2006, and she has been back here this year as the Bennett Fellow. And it is the 50th anniversary of the Bennett Fellowship, and you've been a wonderful 50th Bennett Fellow from the point of view of us here at the bookstore. You've been an incredible patron, and you've connected with the bookselling staff here, and thank you so much for coming back and rejoining the community. I hope it'll happen again at some point in the future. And now you're extending that web of community to Chris, and I'd like to invite you to come forward and introduce Chris. So, Mairead.
Thank you so much. I am, needless to say, I think most of you know, very happy that Exeter has such a wonderful bookstore for me to spend all of my fellowship money in. I'm very excited to introduce Chris McCormick. Chris is a graduate of the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Michigan, where he won Hopwood Awards in both the novel and story form. He currently teaches at Minnesota. He's like, you don't need to do all this. I'm going to do all of this. He's an assistant professor at Minnesota State University. He's written for The Atlantic and the Los Angeles Times, Tin House Plowshares, and elsewhere. And his first book, Desert Boys, won the Stonewall Book Award from the American Library Association, was longlisted for the Chautauqua Prize, named a finalist for the John Gardner Award for Fiction, and was just shortlisted for the William Saroyan International Prize for Writing.
Nice.
Desert Boys is a book of short stories about Daley Kushner, a character we meet as a young man, and as a boy, and as a teenager, and as all of the myriad things between those. The stories are various and formally innovative. They're told in the second person, first and third. They take the forms of lists, of instructions, of a journalist's notes. But all of these accomplished technical acrobatics are always in service of the characters and the book's themes and the emotional cogs the book runs on, which are, among others, the mingled nature of love and shame, the fraying or redoubled ties of family and friendship, and the endless desire for home, even when we aren't sure where or who it is. I think wherever or whoever your home is, you'll recognize it in these pages. Please help me welcome Chris McCormick.
I make her do that every night. It's never gets old for me. It's so nice. Thank you so much for being here, you guys. It means a lot to me. New friends, in some cases, and old friends. I'm going to read just one of the shorter stories towards the end of the book, and then if there are questions, I'll take those, and if not, we'll go celebrate. Yeah, we'll go celebrate either way. All right. As Mairead very kindly said, the whole book is about this kid, Daley, who grows up, leaves the Antelope Valley, which is a desert town in California, Southern California, and then moves up to the Bay Area and has all sorts of adventures, always leading him back home. So by this point in the book, we've met all sorts of friends and family members, and this last, towards the end of the book here, kind of has a different tone in that it's a little bit more summarizing, so there's a bigger kind of sweeping thing, which I kind of like towards the end of the book. Anyways, so I find it as a good introduction if you haven't read the book, even though it's towards the end. So it's called The Missing Antelope of the Antelope Valley. Of course, they weren't antelope at all, but pronghorns. Pronghorns that looked to the treasure-seeking settlers of the California high desert like antelope. Upwards of 80,000 pronghorns grazed the Outer Valley's tussock grass before the completion of the Southern Pacific Railroad line in 1876. The pronghorns, which had coexisted with native human populations for 11,000 years, refused to cross the railroad tracks. This confinement, along with a growing number of fur hunters and, at the turn of the century, a series of bizarre weather patterns, all but killed off the valley's misnomered namesake. The few that survived migrated inland and north and nearly 100 years passed before anyone in town saw an antelope, a pronghorn, that is. Again, that person happened to be my sister. We, Mom and Dad and I, called her Jean, as in denim, but she went around pronouncing her name as if it were the last syllable in Parmesan. Everyone at her high school who'd seen a map of California was taking Spanish, but Jean found herself among the 4 seniors who'd kept with French, the other 3 being Colette, Bertrand, and Jean's best friend, Amélie. Not until year 2 did Jean's teacher mention that pronouncing her name the French way actually made it male, but by this time, Jean, as in Parmesan, had already stuck. Meanwhile, I was enjoying the 8th grade. My parents were so distracted by my sister's college applications and general entanglement with what my mother called womanhood that I was left, by and large, to my own devices. Said devices were few but important and consisted mainly of my best friend, Robert Carringer, and the expanse of uncultivated desert that stretched from the stone wall behind Carringer's trailer park to the back-loading zone of Albertsons, some 3 miles away. Outside my parents' purview, we finished our homework and ran off into the wilderness. We hunted lizards, we studied the carcasses of feral cats, we searched the makeshift dumps for treasures. We slept on warm nights on his roof. We woke early and eavesdropped on Carringer's mother and little sister through the EPDM rubber roofing, ethylene propylene diene monomer, Carringer told me on our first night atop the trailer. He waved his open palm across the surface like a game show model, all spread out over a layer of wood decking. We pressed our ears against the bottoms of empty water glasses, but all we could hear was the running shower and the occasional violence of the blow dryer. A decade after her husband left, Carringer's mother, an avid lottery player, won a sweepstakes for a new tract home on the west side of town. Soon, Carringer would be living in a big house with stairs and a rec room, and I made him promise I could stay over as much as I wanted. Sure, he said, but we'll have to make a concentrated effort to continue spending time outdoors. True, I said. When you're right, you're right. Jean was preparing to hear back from colleges just as Carringer's mother made plans to move from the trailer park into the new house. While the movers did their business, Carringer spent nights at my place. It's decision week, I warned him as he unfurled his sleeping bag on my bedroom floor. The day Jean was accepted to UCLA, the college of her choice, the French club had a study session at the house. Colette hugged her, thinking probably of her own mailbox at home. Bertrand, aware of my father's presence in the room, offered a neutered high five. Amélie, Emily Goodson, who'd been coming over to the house since I was a baby, grabbed Jean by the wrists and jumped up and down with her, squealing for a full minute and a half. She had enormous breasts, and Carringer nudged me to pay attention. I was paying attention, but not for that reason. Of all the French club, I knew her to be the only one staying in the Antelope Valley after high school. I studied her for any signs of envy or devastation, and when I found none, I returned to watching Carringer watch her bounce. Then came summer. As far as I knew, Amélie and Jean were spending every day at the mall. That was true of most teenagers in the Antelope Valley. Carringer was proud to say we were the only ones wise enough to understand the desert. You can find a mall anywhere, can't you? He said. So when, after a long day of digging trenches and bunkers between Joshua trees for a game of paintball, we spotted a parked car reflecting the orange sun next to our dismantled bicycles, we were, at least I was, afraid. But I vaguely recognized the car, and when the doors opened to reveal Jean and, on the driver's side, Amélie, my fear was replaced by a kind of bitterness. The one unspoken rule between my sister and me, keep your worlds separate, had been violated, and I was ready to call foul. However, Robert Carringer, he reminded me with an elbow to the side, was all charm and accommodation. Ladies, he said, what can we do you for? To hear them say it, Amélie and Jean hadn't seen an antelope, but a ghost. Carringer kept asking for details. Where, exactly? Way east, down by the 138. When? Just now. Drove the 20 minutes over here right after spotting him. Him? You're sure it's a male? How do you tell? Well, horns or no horns? Horns. Small ones. How big? I said small. Not the horns. The animal. Big. Real big. I took a different line of questioning myself. I said, What were you and Emily doing out in the desert in the first place? It's Amelie, and we were just going for a drive, that's all. How'd you know where to find me in Carringer? Didn't. Just saw your bike on the side of the road by accident. So what did you stop for? I said. What is it you want from us? I'm beginning to ask myself the same question, jerk. Carringer convinced Amelie and Jean to drive back to the place of the sighting, but could not convince me to leave our bikes behind and join them. I rode home, maneuvering Carringer's bike alongside mine. The next day, I asked Carringer how the search went. Did they see the antelope again? Negative, he said. Waste of time. Should have rode home with you. And that was the last we ever said of the matter. At the end of summer, Jean moved away to college, and Carringer and I started high school. 4 years later, my sister had gone back to Jean, as in denim, and moved east for law school. Carringer and I celebrated our diplomas before he left for boot camp. Then we had our last conversation, and time passed indifferently. The unspoken rule: keep your worlds separate. But once Jean finished law school and decided to stay in New York, and once I moved to San Francisco after college, the rule became enforced not by us, but by the width of a continent. This, we preferred self-enacted divisions, we didn't like. So as we got older, we grew closer. We called each other more often, and Mom got sick and passed away, and I went back to the Antelope Valley temporarily. And Dad was doing fine, selling more furniture than ever, he said, though we had a hard time believing him. He was 62 and still nowhere near retirement. He didn't need me at the house, but I ended up moving home anyway to keep him company, and made some money writing for the internet, which almost anyone can do. Jean kept saying how she felt bad for us. Bad for Dad, mostly, which I joked sounded like a gloomy book by Dr. Seuss. Jean didn't laugh. She was the kind of person who cried in the parking lot if the cashier at Target was over the age of 40. So one day she called and told us to pack our bags. Family vacation, she said, and when I asked where it was she was taking us, she just said to start calling her Jean again. Dad refused to get a passport. He didn't want to be in Paris without his wife. He insisted we go ahead, and Jean asked 1,000,000 times if he was sure. He was sure. Naturally, Jean did all the talking. Having not taken a French class since high school, she must have spoken at a 9th grade level. Still, I listened to the most basic French words fall out of her mouth, and something about the familiarity of her voice, combined with the strange music of her speech, carved out of me so much respect for her, I almost cried when she ordered, at a sidewalk cafe, 2 slices of quiche. We scaled the Eiffel Tower and took selfies on the Champs-Élysées, which I stupidly hadn't known was a street. I'd thought it was a hotel. This was my first time outside of the country, and I clung to Jean everywhere we went. People must have mistaken us for lovers. Jean looked beautiful. Heavy lashes and eyebrows framed her big hazel eyes, and she had this naturally layered brown hair and year-round summer skin and a wide mouth with lips so full it gave her the look of a woman always on the verge of correcting something you're about to say. People like a large mouth on a woman, even in Paris, I bet, and they probably looked at her and thought, why is this beautiful large-mouthed woman with him? Why is she with this young American boy with pale skin and an incomplete beard and skinny jeans unfashionably and unseasonably worn with boat shoes? Why is she with this idiot who keeps calling her by a man's name? The flight the next day wasn't scheduled until the afternoon. So Jean took me to a queer club that night and said, I don't know if there's a place on earth more diametrically opposite to the Antelope Valley than this. We ended up getting a table in the corner beneath large, floating paper orbs of green light. I enjoyed watching the men dance, but the sheer mentioning of the name of our hometown seemed to tether our conversation to it, and our attention stayed there, and we spoke about home over the swelling wub-wub-wubs of the music. I told her about the name of the town, how the antelope weren't really antelope at all. She seemed upset. She was drunk, to be fair, and so was I. And I said, sad, right? Even in Paris, we're talking about the fucking Antelope Valley. Jean thumbed the water on the outside of her glass. Have I ever told you the story of when Emily and I went out looking for one of those antelope whatevers? She said. We were with a guy. I told her I knew. The guy she was talking about was my best friend, Robert Carringer. I reminded her about our meeting in the desert. Weird, she said. I don't remember that. Here's what she remembered. She and Emily, and a guy Emily brought along, drove out at twilight to the eastern edge of the desert. The sky was the beautiful sky you hope for during a sunset, blue and orange upstrokes from behind the mountains. And there, on its hind legs, gnawing at the flower of a Joshua tree, stood an antelope, a pronghorn. Its black nub of a tail swatted yellow flies you could make out in the last of the light. When the animal landed on all fours, it turned to look at the car. Then the pronghorn came walking right up to the road, sauntering, put its face up against the passenger window, the one by Jean's face, as if saying hello. The animal waited there for a while, its black eye staring dumbly into the car. Jean and Emily and the boy in the back seat spoke in the reverent tones of witnesses. Jean was the only one afraid. Emily wanted to open the window and stroke its nose, she said. She told me now. The boy in the back seat, well, he got out of the car on the opposite side and walked slowly around the back of the car to where the antelope was standing. He came up behind it, real slow. The antelope knew he was there and put out his back leg. Not a kick, just slowly put out his leg, I swear to God, like a hand. And this boy, he held on to the hoof. First, he just had one hand on it, as if they were greeting each other. Then he wrapped his other hand around the ankle. He just held the leg for a long time, started petting it, until Emily went out of the car too and stroked the antelope's nose. And the antelope, the pronghorn, let it all happen. Back leg out, nose down. And I just watched and watched, afraid that as soon as I opened the window, he'd dart off. Eventually I did open the window, and I was right. The antelope shook free of the boy and ran off into the desert. And the boy, I can't believe he was your friend. He kept saying on the ride back how the antelope must not have liked something about me. Emily was fine, and he was fine, but something about me scared the animal off. And the boy kept saying we shouldn't tell anybody about this, like it was a secret between us. I think both Emily and I had a little crush on him. He was young. I didn't remember he was that young. But he was a beautiful, white-haired, serious boy. And so, yeah, we agreed we wouldn't tell anyone, that we would keep the antelope, the pronghorn, a secret. The green light of the bulbous lanterns sharpened her features, lengthening the shadows of her cheekbones and nose. She had the look of something between a Halloween store witch and our thinning mother toward the end of chemotherapy. The wub-wub-wubs seemed to increase in frequency and in volume, and although Jean continued to speak, I stopped straining to hear her. Soon we would catch our flights, Jean to New York, me to the Antelope Valley, and I didn't know when I would see her next. Suddenly I imagined this was the last moment we'd ever share, and because I knew she would go on to remember it differently than I would, I ached to do something so spectacular and unordinary that if every other memory of Paris were to be corrupted, at least we'd have this. I stood, accidentally knocking one of the green orbs into a sway, and held out my hand. Jean, I said, the French way. And soon, while everyone else in the club beat their bodies against the thick air between them, I held her, my sister, depending on the swinging light, or my mother, or Carringer, and danced, slowly, to another kind of music. Je t'aime, I said, through her hair, into her ear. I love you too, she said into mine. Moi aussi je t'aime. When you spend a life leaving a place, only to return to it again and again, the returns become increasingly shameful. One way to deal with this shame is to create theories that either justify your returns or else allow you the possibility of actually leaving, once and for all. This time my theory is this. The Antelope, the pronghorn, somehow knew that Emily and Carringer were different from Jean. Emily, married, pregnant with twins, continues to live in the Antelope Valley, just off Avenue N, where the water tower looms in the foothills. Carringer became a husband and a father after joining the Marines, and I'm convinced he would have lived in town the rest of his life if he hadn't gone off and died in a different desert. My theory, I guess, is that the pronghorn knew Emily and Carringer were meant to stay, and Jean was meant to leave. All places maybe bear these two kinds of people, and ours just happens to have a way to tell the difference. It's a hypothesis anyway. In order to make it a theory, I have to run a test. So in the late afternoon, I tell my dad I love him. I'm heading out. I drive my mother's old car east, away from the light and the railroad tracks, far out into the desert. I leave the road and go as far as the Toyota's tires will take me before they fail, settling for good in the soft grip of the dirt. The headlights I leave on, and the keys I throw 30 feet into an enormous heap of tumbleweeds. I remove my shirt and shoes and sit. Far off, the sun falls, slowly at first, and then as quickly as a dropped coin, behind the San Gabriel Mountains. This is death country, and I'm either going to survive it or not. Under the bleeding sky, I wait for the antelope, the pronghorn, the god of staying and the god of leaving, to show me what kind of man I am. Thank you. So thanks for coming out. I really do appreciate it. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk a little bit, and we can all go party. No, good. Thank you guys so much for coming. And you can always ask me. Oh, Derek, hey.
I've got a question. I'm curious about when in the process of the book you wrote that story, was that the last one? And if not, how did you sort of predict the sweep that it would be to close up?
It was the last one. When I wrote it, I thought it was the last one. And then when I sold the book, my editor at Picador thought one of the characters, the third friend, needed his own story. So I ended up writing one more story before the book was published. But at the time of writing it, I thought it was the last story. So I kind of had this overview kind of tone that was new to me, and sweeping in time and all this kind of stuff. Felt natural. It was one of the, I hardly ever touched it when in editing. It kind of, it just came out as it was in a way, which is the opposite of every other story in the book. She took a lot of work. Yeah.
Can you talk a little about, maybe this is a linked collection, about place, a single character, and so I know there are some other linked collections you had in mind as you were writing it, but I wondered, especially removed from it, if you see the other books in his company, you kind of envision it or hope it's keeping other authors.
Yeah. I think linked short story collections kind of get a bad rap. They feel like a novelist doesn't have the energy to write a real novel. So like it's short stories, but it's connected, so it's kind of like a novel. But I actually love this genre. It's one of my favorite kinds of books, and I think it's particularly suited to literature about place. I think of places that way, kind of in sections or in moments, right? Specific moments of my experience in a place, having different locations within that place. So it feels almost like a kind of map in a way. So Dubliners is like a very famous example of a story collection like that. But the Winesburg, Ohio is probably like the most cited version of that. But My Name is Aram, which is a linked short story collection by William Saroyan. It was a big influence on me, not only because I'm half Armenian and I grew up with kind of Armenian stories, but also as like a way to tell a larger story in a comical tone. If you have like shorter, you can do tonally different things in each section. So I liked the idea of having a story that was funny and then a story that was kind of depressing afterwards. And so there's a little bit more leeway tonally than a straight novel. So those are some of the books. I think, who else? I mean, I'm blanking. You probably know the answer better than I do. We've talked about this.
Mm.
Yeah, I didn't love that book, but it is a good example of that form.
Did you read Pond?
I haven't read that.
Pond.
No.
So good.
No, you like Pond a lot.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of a recent example. Let me think more about that.
Yeah.
I know.
I mean, you
I'm,
just
like,
love your short stories and your short story masters in general.
Yeah. Yeah, like Amy Hempel is someone who doesn't write a linked collection per se, but I think of her stories as having like there's a lot of San Francisco stories where the earthquake is just like constantly looming as this threat in every one of her stories. So linked not by character in the way that mine is, but linked by a kind of pressure that is existent in every single one. Again, a kind of place thing. I think there's a million examples. Yeah. You know. What else? Anything else? Any questions? Thank you again. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Sam, for having me.